The snow fell in slow, whispering sheets across the frozen fields of Belarus, but it did nothing to silence the screams. The German patrol moved through the woods with their rifles raised, boots crunching into the crusted ice as though the land itself was breaking beneath them. They had chased the last surviving group of Soviet female soldiers for nearly 2 hours, tracking them by blood drops and broken branches, like hunting wounded animals instead of trained fighters. What waited at the end of that chase was not a battlefield victory, but something far darker, something even the German officers hesitated to speak of afterward. Most people today imagine the Eastern Front as a clash of tanks and artillery, steel grinding against steel, cities collapsing under fire. But the ground truth, what the soldiers actually witnessed, was far more intimate and brutal. It was in the forests, in the swamps, in the abandoned barns where prisoners were cornered and stripped of their rank, their dignity, and their humanity. And nothing enraged the Wehrmacht more than discovering that the Russians had dared to put women on the front lines. They viewed it as dishonor, as an insult, as a threat to the entire mythology of German superiority. Capturing a Soviet woman in uniform was, to them, an invitation to cruelty. The unit they were chasing belonged to the 586th, one of the Red Army's female detachments that had fought fiercely from Stalingrad to the forests of Smolensk. These women were not nurses, not auxiliaries. They were soldiers. They carried rifles, grenades, and the same weight of fear that every man carried into battle. They fought in winter trenches, slept in dugouts, and bled for the same homeland. And because of that, because they fought like men, the Germans labelled them monstrosities. Stories had circulated among the ranks, whispered exaggerations about savage Russian women who mutilated prisoners or poisoned wells. It wasn't true, but fear made lies feel like truth, and hatred did the rest. As the German patrol approached the tree line, they found signs of a recent firefight, bullet casings frozen into the mud, a shattered field pack, and the stiffened body of a Soviet woman lying half-buried in snow. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her rifle was still clutched in her hand. The officer kicked it away, ordering his men to search the area. They knew others had escaped deeper into the woods. Somewhere in the branches above, a crow shrieked, as if warning anyone who could still listen that the hunt was not over. The surviving Russian women, 3 in total, had taken cover near a half-collapsed bunker built during the first months of the war. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and out of ammunition. Their commander, Lieutenant Irina Solovyova, pressed her back against the cold concrete and listened for the German voices approaching. She had sent 2 scouts ahead earlier that morning, but neither returned. Now she feared both had been captured or killed. She knew what happened when Germans caught female soldiers alive. She had seen enough bodies left behind on the snow to understand the price. Irina had joined the Red Army not out of ideology, but out of necessity. Her village had been destroyed in 1941. Her brother killed during the first German advance. She had nothing left except rage, and the war offered her a direction for it. The training had been merciless. The front was worse. She had seen comrades blown apart, burned alive, frozen to death in trenches, but she had held on to one belief, that fighting was better than waiting to be victimized. Women on the Eastern Front had no illusions. Surrender did not guarantee mercy. For many, it guaranteed the opposite. The crunch of boots approached the bunker, slow and deliberate. The 3 women exchanged a look, not of fear, but of resignation. They had 1 grenade left between them. Irina held it in her palm, thumb on the pin, deciding whether it was better to die in the blast than fall into German hands. A gust of wind swept snow across the entrance, momentarily blurring the world like a ghost drifting between them and the trees. She whispered something to her surviving comrade, Yelena, who nodded without speaking. Their third, a younger girl named Katya, began to cry silently, her breath turning to frost. But the Germans were not fools. They didn't rush the bunker, they surrounded it. The officer called out in broken Russian, demanding surrender. He promised safety, food, warmth, lies wrapped in soft words. The women knew them well. Dozens of captured female soldiers had believed those promises before being subjected to humiliations that were never written into official reports. Some were used as propaganda trophies, photographed and mocked. Others were handed over to rear units where discipline was lax and officers acted without oversight. A few simply vanished. Irina gripped the grenade tighter, but she couldn't bring herself to pull the pin. Not yet. She still believed escape was possible, somehow against all reason. She motioned for Yelena to crawl to the back of the bunker, where a narrow shaft led to a small drainage canal. It was barely wide enough for a grown woman, but desperation made bodies smaller. If even one of them got out, one might survive to report what had happened. But before they could move, a German soldier tossed something into the bunker. It bounced twice, hitting the wall with a metallic clink. Not a grenade, an empty can, deliberately thrown to test their reaction. Their hesitation exposed them. Within seconds, the Germans stormed the entrance, rifles aimed, shouting orders. The three women were dragged into the open snow, their hands bound behind them. Irina tried to fight, kicking and twisting until the butt of a rifle smashed into her ribs. Yelena had her hair pulled so violently that a patch tore from her scalp. Katya collapsed entirely, too weak to stand. The wind howled through the trees, carrying their cries across the frozen ground. The officer stepped forward, removing his gloves as he studied the prisoners. He inspected their uniforms, their rank patches, their papers. When he saw Irina's lieutenant insignia, something flickered across his face, contempt mixed with curiosity. He circled them slowly, as though inspecting livestock. His men laughed quietly behind him, already guessing what would come next. The power imbalance tasted intoxicating to them. On this front, cruelty had no ceiling. Irina's eyes met his, and for a moment neither looked away. In that frozen stare was everything the war had created: hatred, pain, fear, defiance. The officer finally turned to his men and issued an order in a cold, flat voice. It was an order the women had prayed not to hear, the one they knew meant the beginning of a nightmare that would not end quickly. And as the soldiers stepped forward, as the trees seemed to bend under the weight of what was about to unfold, a distant artillery rumble echoed across the forest. Soviet guns miles away, but approaching. Irina's heart jolted with a spark of impossible hope. But for now, hope meant nothing. The Germans had them, and the real horror was only beginning. The women were marched through the forest with their hands bound, stumbling through knee-deep snow as the Germans prodded them forward. The cold gnawed at their exposed skin like a living creature, chewing through cloth and flesh with equal indifference. The sun had not risen fully, leaving the woods in a grey half-light that made every shadow look like a figure watching from a distance. Birds scattered from the treetops as the patrol advanced, but the forest itself felt silent, almost complicit, as though it had seen such marches countless times before and had learned not to interfere. Irina's breath came in ragged bursts, each inhale stabbing her ribs where the rifle butt had struck her. Yelena tried to steady her, whispering quick fragments of strength under her breath, but the Germans shouted for silence and struck her across the back. Katya, the youngest of the three, struggled the most. Her legs buckled every few steps, and each time she fell the soldiers hauled her back up with coarse hands and colder intentions. The officer didn't look at her directly. He didn't need to. His silence alone dictated what would happen once they reached their destination. The men exchanged glances heavy with unspoken meaning, the kind of looks that made Katya lower her eyes to the ground and pray for a miracle that would never come. After half an hour of trudging through the unforgiving terrain, they reached a clearing where an old hunting cabin stood crookedly against a cluster of pines. Its roof sagged, its windows broken, and its door hung open as though welcoming whatever horrors chose to take refuge inside. It was the kind of place villagers avoided long after the war, a place where the air felt wrong even without knowing the history. The officer ordered the prisoners inside, and the door slammed shut behind them with a thud that echoed through their bones. The smell hit them first: mud, smoke, wet wood, and something faintly metallic that suggested past suffering. Inside, the soldiers lit a lantern that cast long shadows across the walls, turning the cabin into a theatre of flickering nightmares. The room was small, barely large enough to hold them all, and the lack of space forced the women against one another as the men circled them like wolves, waiting to choose their prey. Irina lifted her chin, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she still had left, but Yelena trembled beside her, her breath shaking as she tried not to collapse. Katya stood motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing, as though her mind had already left the room. The officer stepped forward and removed his helmet, placing it carefully on a nearby table. He wiped the frost from his face and studied the prisoners with a look that made the air grow colder. He spoke in German, his sentences sharp and clipped. The men around him laughed, nodding eagerly as though waiting for permission to do what they had already decided on. Irina understood only fragments of his words, but she understood enough. He despised them, not because they were enemies — he had killed many Russian soldiers without hesitation — but because they were women who had dared to fight. To him, that alone was an unforgivable insult. When he finally addressed them in broken Russian, his voice carried a kind of false civility that felt more dangerous than outright hostility. He asked their names, their ranks, their units. Irina gave only her surname, refusing to say more. Yelena hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. Katya said nothing at all. The officer slapped her across the face, not in anger, but in boredom, as though she were a disobedient child rather than a prisoner of war. She crumpled to her knees, blood dripping from her lip, her body shaking uncontrollably. Irina lunged toward her, but the soldiers seized her arms and held her back. The officer approached slowly, crouching in front of Katya with a kind of chilling patience. He lifted her chin with 2 fingers, forcing her to look into his eyes. She resisted weakly, turning her head away, but he grabbed her by the hair and yanked it back with deliberate cruelty. Yelena cried out, unable to contain herself. But the butt of a rifle struck her stomach and knocked the breath out of her. The cabin floor creaked under the tension, as though the wood itself wanted to splinter from the weight of what was happening inside it. The men began to separate the prisoners, dragging Irina to one side and Yelena to another. Katya was left in the center of the room, her arms pinned behind her by 2 soldiers. Irina thrashed against her captors, her screams muffled by a hand over her mouth. She could do nothing but watch as the officer circled Katya like a predator, selecting exactly how he wanted to break her. Every second felt like an hour, every breath like torture. She prayed for the Soviet artillery she had heard earlier to arrive, for anything at all to interrupt what was about to unfold, but nothing came. The soldiers worked methodically, their cruelty practiced, almost mechanical. They tore the women from their uniforms as though stripping away their identity, their strength, their belief in themselves. For Irina, the violation was not only physical but spiritual. She had fought for years, survived countless battles, watched friends die beside her. But this helplessness, this forced submission, felt like the true death. Yelena's sobs filled the cabin, echoing through the wooden walls and into the forest beyond, but the trees gave no shelter, no judgment, no mercy. Hours dragged by in a haze of humiliation and suffering. When the soldiers finally finished, the women lay scattered across the floor like broken dolls, their bodies bruised, their spirits hollowed out. The lantern flickered weakly overhead, casting a sickly light that made the scene look like a photograph from the darkest corner of history. The officer buttoned his uniform neatly, as though nothing had happened, and instructed his men to leave the prisoners on the floor to recover, or to die, whichever came first. To him, it made no difference. The Germans stepped outside, slamming the door and locking it from the outside. The sudden silence was almost unbearable. Irina tried to push herself upright but collapsed again, her legs refusing to obey. Yelena crawled toward her, her hands trembling as she touched her shoulder. Katya lay curled against the wall, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, her breathing shallow and erratic. None of them spoke. There were no words left. Even if they had tried, their throats would have closed around the pain. Night began to fall, and the temperature inside the cabin dropped sharply. Snow piled against the windowsills, sealing them inside a prison made of ice and memory. Irina forced herself to sit up, pulling Yelena close, whispering that they had to find a way out before the Germans returned. She didn't know if they could survive another encounter. She didn't even know if they could survive the night. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: if they stayed here, they would die, either by cold, by despair, or by the hands of the Germans when they came back to finish what they had started. She crawled toward the door, testing its strength. It was locked solidly, the windows were boarded, the walls were thick. But the cabin wasn't entirely sealed. There were gaps in the floorboards where cold air seeped through, and beneath those gaps was the ground. If they could pry up even a single plank, they might crawl underneath the cabin and escape into the forest. It was a desperate plan, almost impossible, but desperation was all they had left. Irina looked at the others, her eyes swollen but still burning with a faint, stubborn fire. She whispered that they would not die here, not like this, not forgotten and nameless in a frozen cabin. And as the wind howled outside, carrying the distant thunder of artillery once more, she clawed at the first loose floorboard with fingers that no longer felt pain, because survival wasn't just a choice anymore. It was vengeance waiting to be born. The floorboard groaned as Irina tore at it with broken nails, each pull sending splinters into her skin. But she didn't stop. Pain had become background noise, a distant echo compared to everything they had already endured. Yelena knelt beside her, helping as best she could, her fingers trembling with exhaustion. Katya remained in the corner, curled against the wall like a shadow, her eyes empty and unfocused. The lantern had begun to dim, its flame flickering wildly as though it too struggled to survive the cold. Every second mattered. Every breath carried the weight of the next decision. At last, Irina managed to loosen a single plank enough to wedge her fingers beneath it. She pulled with all the strength she had left until it snapped free with a crack that echoed through the cabin. The women froze, listening for footsteps outside. But the forest remained silent, and the Germans were nowhere near. Irina motioned for Yelena to help widen the opening. Beneath the cabin, the space was tight, filled with frozen mud and tangled roots. But it was a path, crude, suffocating, but still a path. Katya stared at the gap, her expression haunted, as though the world had blurred into something she could no longer comprehend. Irina crawled toward her, pulling her gently from the wall. Katya flinched at the touch, recoiling instinctively, but Irina cupped her face and whispered that they had to leave now. Her voice cracked with urgency, with fear, with hope she barely believed in. Slowly Katya nodded, though her body moved like it belonged to someone else. The three women gathered around the gap in the floor, the lantern's dying flame casting a faint halo around them. Irina lowered herself first, sliding into the cramped space beneath the cabin, until the cold earth pressed against her cheek. Yelena followed, her breath sharp against the icy ground. Katya came last, trembling violently as she squeezed herself into the darkness. The crawl was agonizing. The space was barely high enough for them to breathe without scraping their backs against the underside of the floorboards. Mud clung to their faces, freezing instantly in the bitter air. Roots snagged their hair and uniforms, tearing at them with each movement. Every inch forward felt like pushing through the grave itself. But inch by inch, the three women dragged themselves toward the back of the cabin, where the foundation met the open forest floor. Irina dug at the snow-covered earth, forcing her way through until the cold wind hit her face like a slap. They were outside. They were free, at least for now. The forest loomed around them in complete darkness, its trees towering over them like silent guardians. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the ground in a layer of white that muffled their movements. Irina guided them deeper into the woods, careful to avoid leaving obvious tracks. The moon hid behind a curtain of clouds, turning the night into a grey void where shapes twisted and shifted with every gust of wind. Katya stumbled repeatedly, her legs too weak to carry her weight. Yelena supported her as best she could, though she too was fading fast. Irina pushed forward, driven by something greater than fear. Survival had become her only anchor, the thread that kept her mind from unraveling. Every step hurt, every breath felt like swallowing knives, but the farther they moved from the cabin, the louder her heartbeat became, pounding with a rhythm that reminded her she was still alive. She didn't know if the Germans would discover their escape in minutes or hours. She didn't know if artillery fire in the distance meant help or more danger. But she knew staying in that cabin meant certain death. They trudged for nearly an hour before Yelena collapsed into the snow, her legs giving out beneath her. Irina rushed to her side, shaking her gently. Yelena insisted she was fine, but the purple bruises across her ribs told a different story. Katya sank to her knees beside them, her breath rapid and uneven. The cold had burrowed into their bones. Hypothermia whispered in the back of their minds, promising a quiet, painless end if they stopped moving. Irina refused to listen. She forced them back to their feet, urging them forward toward a cluster of birch trees where she hoped to find shelter. The birches stood thin and ghostly, their white bark glowing faintly in the darkness. Behind them lay a small ravine, hidden beneath a curtain of low-hanging branches. Irina led the others down into it, shielded from the wind at last. The three women huddled together beneath the trees, sharing what little warmth their shaking bodies could produce. Irina gathered branches with numb fingers, trying to build a small shelter of snow and wood. It wouldn't keep them warm, but it would keep them alive long enough to think. Yelena pressed against Katya, whispering comforting words that barely reached beyond her lips. For the first time since their escape, silence settled over them. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of exhaustion so deep it numbed the soul. Irina stared up at the sky, watching the clouds drift like smoke across the moon. Each cloud reminded her of artillery blasts, of burning villages, of everything she had lost long before this night. She wondered if her family would ever know what happened to her. She wondered if she would ever see another sunrise. But most of all, she wondered how much more suffering a human being could endure before breaking beyond repair. Snow continued to fall, burying their tracks and concealing them from wandering patrols. For now, the forest offered its cold protection, though it cared nothing for their fate. Hours passed in slow agony. Katya drifted in and out of consciousness, her head resting on Yelena's lap. Yelena sang softly, an old folk melody, broken by sobs, to keep the girl anchored to the world. Irina fought sleep with every fibre of her strength. She knew that closing her eyes, even for a moment, could mean slipping into a cold sleep she would never wake from. By dawn, the world had turned pale blue. The forest glowed with frost, every branch glittering like glass. But the fragile beauty did little to warm their spirits. Irina forced herself upright, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The Germans would be searching. Dogs, patrols, tracks. They could be anywhere. She nudged Yelena awake, whispering that they had to move again. Their best chance was to head east, toward the faint echo of Soviet artillery. If they could reach even a small scouting unit, they might survive. If not, the forest would swallow them whole. As they began walking again, the sound of distant engines rolled through the trees. Irina froze. It wasn't artillery, too steady, too mechanical. The rumble grew louder, closer. Yelena grabbed Katya's arm, pulling her behind a fallen log. Irina dropped to the ground, her heart slamming against her ribs. Through the branches, she caught a glimpse of green-grey uniforms and the unmistakable round helmets of a German search party. They were less than 100 meters away, moving in a sweeping formation. The officer from the cabin rode at the front on a motorcycle, scanning the forest with icy precision. Irina clenched her fists, fighting the urge to tremble. The Germans were hunting them, and they would not stop, not until the women were dragged back into darkness. The time for hiding was nearly over, because what stalked them now wasn't just soldiers, it was vengeance wearing a uniform. The search party moved like a machine, each soldier spaced evenly apart, their boots crunching through the snow with a rhythm that sent chills down Irina's spine. She pressed herself lower behind the fallen log, the bark digging into her cheek. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but running meant death. She watched as the officer dismounted his motorcycle, scanning the trees with sharp, predatory eyes. He wasn't simply tracking escaped prisoners, he was hunting personal prey. Women he believed he still owned, women he intended to break again. Irina felt her pulse tighten until her entire body vibrated with dread. Yelena held Katya close, whispering for her to stay quiet. Katya's breath came in rapid, shallow bursts, each one threatening to give them away. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide with terror that seemed to hollow her out. She had survived the cabin, survived the cold, survived the escape. But this was something different. This was the moment where everything balanced on a single heartbeat. One cry, one crack of a branch, one wrong movement, and the forest would swallow them in the worst way imaginable. Yelena covered Katya's mouth gently, her hands shaking with fear and devotion. The Germans spread out, following a rough semicircle that cut across the ravine. Irina watched their approach, calculating every angle, every line of sight. She counted 7 men plus the officer. One of them held a dog on a leash, a lean animal with ribs showing through its fur and a nose trained to the scent of blood and human despair. Irina's heart collapsed when she saw it. The dog raised its head, sniffing the air, and pulled sharply toward their hiding spot. The handler tightened his grip, muttered something, and followed the animal's lead. Their direction was unmistakable. Irina reached for a stone on the ground, her fingers numb but determined. She didn't have the strength to throw it far, but she hurled it toward a cluster of trees on the opposite side of the ravine. The stone struck a branch with a loud crack. The dog whipped its head in that direction and barked. The soldiers turned instantly, shouting, pointing, rifles raised. The entire formation shifted toward the sound. Irina's chest tightened with disbelief. It had worked. Yelena looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, a flicker of hope returning to her bruised face. But the officer did not move. He remained still, staring directly ahead with a cold, calculating expression. His eyes drifted across the ravine, sweeping left, then right, then settling on the fallen log. It was only for a fraction of a second, but Irina felt it like a knife. He hadn't seen them, not yet, but his instincts had. He barked an order to the others, sending 2 soldiers ahead while he stayed behind to watch the tree line. The distraction had only bought them seconds, not safety. Irina bit her lip until she tasted blood, forcing her mind to work through the rising panic. She leaned close to Yelena and whispered that they had to move now while the officer's attention was split. The ravine sloped upward on the opposite side, leading to a dense thicket that might conceal them, but reaching it meant crawling through open snow. Yelena hesitated, glancing at Katya, whose body sagged between them like a wounded bird. Irina cupped her face, her voice soft but fierce, telling her they could not stay here. Staying meant capture. Capture meant returning to the cabin, or worse. Yelena nodded, tears freezing on her lashes as she lifted Katya's limp arm. They crawled slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate, their bodies hugging the ground as though trying to merge with it. Snow seeped into their clothes, burning their skin with icy needles. Irina moved first, sliding forward inch by inch, her limbs screaming in protest. Yelena followed with Katya, who drifted in and out of consciousness, her eyes rolling back with exhaustion. The Germans' voices echoed behind them, sharp and urgent as they combed the forest in widening arcs. Irina could almost feel the officer's gaze on her back, like a blade hovering just above her spine. When they reached the base of the opposite slope, Irina motioned for Yelena to push Katya upward. It was slow, agonizing work. The snow slid beneath them, sending small cascades of powder tumbling down the ravine like whispers threatening to betray them. The thicket above rustled under the wind, a curtain of branches that swayed invitingly. Irina dug her fingers into the frozen earth, pulling herself upward with raw determination. Behind them the dog barked again, closer this time, much closer. The officer shouted something and boots thundered across the forest floor. Irina grabbed Katya's arm and heaved her upward with a strength she didn't know she still possessed. Yelena pushed from below. Katya collapsed into the thicket, disappearing inside it. Irina and Yelena scrambled after her, forcing their bodies through the branches until the shadows swallowed them whole. The thicket was dense, thick with undergrowth and fallen branches. They crawled on their stomachs beneath the lowest branches where the snow didn't fully reach. It was cramped, suffocating, but the tangled growth hid them completely from sight. The search party reached the ravine seconds later. Irina held her breath as Boots marched just meters away. She could see their silhouettes through the gaps in the branches, dark shapes against the pale snow. The dog pulled violently toward the thicket, growling low in its throat. Irina felt her body go rigid. The handler yanked it back, muttering curses as he tried to force it to follow the patrol's earlier path. But the animal refused, clawing at the ground, whining softly. Yelena's hand tightened around Irina's wrist. Katya trembled silently, her fingers digging into the earth beneath her. The officer stepped forward. His boots stopped, just a few feet from where they lay hidden. Irina watched through a sliver between branches as he surveyed the ravine, his breath visible in the cold air. He turned slowly, scanning the trees, the snow, the slopes. His eyes passed over their hiding spot twice. Irina felt the world stop each time. She closed her eyes, praying, though she no longer believed in anything, to remain invisible. For a moment he seemed ready to order the thicket searched, but then a distant rifle shot cracked through the forest. The officer snapped his head toward the sound. A second shot followed. A German soldier shouted, sharply, urgently. The officer cursed under his breath, barked new orders, and the search party pivoted toward the gunfire. The dog whined, resisting, but the handler dragged it away. Within seconds, the ravine emptied. The Germans disappeared into the forest like shadows swallowed by fog. Irina remained frozen in place until the sound of boots and voices faded entirely into the trees. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. The women stayed beneath the thicket for nearly an hour, listening for any sign of return. None came. Finally, Irina whispered that they had to move again. They crawled deeper into the woods, keeping low, following the natural dips in the terrain. Katya's condition worsened. She drifted like someone half asleep, her legs buckling with every step. Yelena supported her with sheer willpower. Irina led the way, though pain gnawed at every corner of her body. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Because survival was no longer just a fight to live. It had become a refusal to let the enemy decide how their story ended. The farther they walked, the louder the artillery became, no longer distant, but near enough to vibrate through the ground. The forest lit faintly with the flash of explosions beyond the hills. Irina recognized the cadence of Soviet batteries. They were close to the front line, dangerously close, but close enough that hope, real hope, began to spark in her chest. Yelena heard it too and clutched Katya tighter, whispering that they were almost safe. But war rarely granted such mercy without a price. And the price they were about to face would test what little strength they had left. The forests around Smolensk were silent in the months after liberation, but the silence carried an unease the villagers couldn't explain. They walked the same dirt paths the Germans once patrolled, passing broken helmets and rusted wire tangled in the undergrowth, knowing the ground held secrets no one wanted to speak aloud. Soviet search teams moved slowly through these woods, probing the soil with thin metal rods until the dull thud of earth meeting bone revealed another hidden grave. They uncovered buttons, scraps of fabric, a torn field scarf printed with faded red stars, and sometimes a lock of braided hair still knotted with frost. Every discovery forced them to understand the scale of what had happened, and each time they brushed the soil aside, they realized they were not exhuming the dead. They were confronting the truth someone tried to erase. Families came looking for daughters who had never returned from the front, clinging to the faint hope that maybe the telegram had been wrong. Mothers asked the same question over and over. Did she suffer, or did she die quickly? The officers collecting statements could rarely meet their eyes. They had seen too many bodies arranged like discarded objects, too many wrists bound behind backs with the same methodical knots, too many bullet wounds placed with the same chilling precision. Villagers who had lived under occupation spoke in fragments, whispering about the girls taken at night or the ones dragged behind the trucks. Their testimonies blended into a single painful pattern. The Germans had not simply killed these young soldiers. They had tried to break them, erase them, and leave no memory of what they endured. But memories have a way of defying burial. Survivors who crawled out of shallow pits or escaped through dense brush spoke of the last moments inside makeshift camps. They remembered the cold breath of winter seeping through rotting boards, the sound of boots pacing outside, and the quiet sobs of other captured women trying to stay invisible. Some recalled watching their friends taken behind barns, behind vehicles, behind any structure that offered the Germans a moment of secrecy. And when the screams began, the surviving prisoners understood that the Wehrmacht's discipline meant nothing here. The officers acted with absolute impunity, believing the war's chaos would swallow their crimes. Yet, as each survivor testified, the facade of German order dissolved, revealing a brutality that was both systematic and personal. When the Red Army pushed westward, the anger within their ranks took on a force no commander could fully restrain. Soldiers who found the bodies of their female comrades poured that fury into every engagement that followed. They stormed machine gun nests with reckless abandon, shouting the names of women whose faces they could barely remember. For them, revenge was not a word, it was a direction. They marched through towns where German propaganda once boomed through loudspeakers, now echoing only with the crackle of burning roofs. Some units carved messages into abandoned walls, simple lines like "for our sisters" or "for the girls." The war became personal, and the Eastern Front's savagery escalated beyond anything the world had seen. In the years after the victory, the Soviet government published only fragments of what had happened to their captured women. The official narrative favored heroism, not vulnerability. Reports softened details, testimonies were locked away, and the fate of these soldiers became a quiet shadow in wartime history. Families received medals on behalf of daughters who were listed as fallen in battle, not tortured in captivity. For a nation rebuilding itself from ashes, some truths were deemed too painful, too destabilizing, too complex to share with a population already drowning in grief. And so the stories of these women were preserved only in small circles, within families, among surviving comrades, and in the sealed archives that waited for historians not yet born. Yet in the ruins of old villages, people remembered more than the state allowed. Elderly women passed down stories whispered during winter evenings, tales of Russian girls in uniform led away by German patrols. Some recalled how those captured walked with trembling legs but held their heads high, refusing to show fear. Others remembered how the Germans, desperate for dominance, reacted violently to any sign of courage. Their brutality was not just an act of war, it was a method to crush identity, humanity, and defiance. Still, the captured women did not break as completely as their captors wished. Even in their final moments, many chose silence over pleading, dignity over surrender. The villagers spoke of them not as victims, but as spirits that haunted the land with unspoken strength. Decades later, when researchers finally gained access to wartime archives, they were confronted with documents no historian prepares for. Field reports written by German officers described the captured female soldiers as dangerous elements, whose morale threatened discipline. Those phrases concealed the truth, but eyewitness statements filled the gaps. Some officers wrote candidly about interrogations carried out without restraint. Others documented transfers to remote barns and depots that served as unofficial punishment sites. There were no formal orders authorizing these acts, just a culture of cruelty that flourished wherever the chain of command loosened. The historian reading these pages felt as though the past itself flinched, forcing him to pause between each line, as if acknowledging the weight of what had been hidden. Among the most haunting discoveries were the personal belongings recovered near execution sites. A dented canteen engraved with initials, a small notebook containing a half-finished poem, a pair of boots stuffed with straw for warmth. Such items, ordinary and fragile, forced investigators to see the victims not as faceless casualties, but as young women who once wrote letters home, laughed with comrades, argued about politics, dreamed of a future beyond war. Their belongings told a story the official reports never did, that behind every act of brutality was a life interrupted, a voice silenced, a future stolen. The realization left even hardened researchers struggling to continue. Today, walking through the same forests where those graves were found, one feels an unease that has nothing to do with the rustling branches or cold wind. It is the sensation of stillness weighted with memory. The ground beneath carries more than soil. It carries a history that breathes. Travelers who know nothing of the past often speak of a strange chill when they pass certain clearings, as if the air thickens for a moment. Locals say it is the presence of those who never made it home, the women whose final cries were swallowed by the night. Whether one believes such stories or not, the feeling is unmistakable. Something remains. In the end, the tragedy of these captured Russian women cannot be confined to government reports or historical essays. It lingers in the landscape, in the families who waited for letters that never came, in the soldiers who carried their memory through battle after battle. Their suffering became part of the Eastern Front's legacy, a silent testament carved not in monuments, but in the scars of a continent. And even now, after so many decades, one truth refuses to fade. The cruelty inflicted on them was not forgotten by the land, nor by the few who lived to remember. Their voices may be lost to time, but their shadows still walk the forests where history tried to bury them, reminding anyone who listens that some wounds never fully close.